Across Europe in recent weeks, fears of the effects of the global downturn has led to unrest in the streets. In the UK, there have been demonstrations against foreign workers being brought in to do jobs wanted by British workers. And in countries as far afield as the US, Canada and Australia, some are arguing that as unemployment rates rise, immigration controls should be tightened. With me is Philippe Legrain of the LSE and the author of Immigrants, Your Country Needs Them, and Gerard Batten, a member of the European Parliament for the UK Independence Party, who would probably add, "Oh no, we don't," to the title of your book. But let's start, Philippe, with you. In this situation, why should countries need immigrants at a time when they've got lots of unemployed people in the country who weren't unemployed before but are now looking for jobs?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Even in a recession, I think that there are still jobs that need doing, and very often immigrants bring with them skills or willingness to do jobs that local people don't have. For example, in Britain at the moment there is a shortage of maths teachers. You can't train up a British person to be a maths teacher overnight. In the Gulf states there is still a huge demand for labour for people to do manual labour. In the United States there is still a demand for people to go work in Silicon Valley. Even in a recession there are still jobs that local people cannot or will not do, and that's why you need immigration.
So like you, yes. Bankers who've lost their jobs don't want to work at McDonald's.
Exactly. I mean, there's in Britain, for example, and across Europe, where populations are ageing, there's a shortage of people to look after the elderly, and unemployed bankers or people who've lost their jobs in other high-skilled areas are not going to retrain to be care workers.
Does that case convince you? No, it doesn't.
Well, so far, actually, David, I agree with Philip, because my party's policy is we're not anti-immigration. What we want is controlled immigration. We're not against immigration, but we feel now that the age of mass immigration should end for a whole number of reasons.
Yeah, because
that's what we've had.
Yes?
That's what we've had. What we want is controlled immigration.
The idea that we have uncontrolled immigration, we certainly don't. I mean, you just have to look at how many African people die each year trying to reach Europe to see that the borders clearly are not open, or likewise people who come through the eastern route through Afghanistan and the Balkans. So there clearly isn't uncontrolled immigration.
Well, that's what
but there's still. Do you think there is?
Oh yes, of course there is. I mean, if you've got 450 million people who have the right to come to the UK if they want to, in a population currently of about 61 million, you've got to describe that as uncontrolled. And on the borders of the European Union, waiting to come in, are the candidate countries like Croatia, Turkey, which, if they come in within the next 10 years, say, would give another 79 million people the right to come here. If you look at all the countries that are applying to join the European Union, it adds up to about 157 million people. That's absolute nonsense.
Which country is, for instance, the most strict on immigration, against it?
Probably Japan. But even Japan is starting to crumble because as its population ages, the Japanese realise that first of all they need people to look after their elderly, and second of all they don't have enough young people to do the jobs, so they're increasingly find backdoor ways of letting people in. I think from a global perspective, actually the striking thing actually is not how many immigrants there are, but how few there are. There are 6.5 billion odd people in the world, and only 200 of those million live outside the country where they were born. That's less than 3% of the population. So from a global perspective, actually, the remarkable thing is how low it is. Even within the European Union, where, as Gerard says, people can now move freely, only actually a very small proportion do. I mean, if it was true, you know, the fear is, well, you know, you open our borders and everyone from poor countries moves to rich ones. And the fact is that the maximum estimate of the people who've moved to this country on a temporary basis since the borders were open to Eastern Europe is 1 million. That's out of a total population in Eastern Europe of 75. And most of them have already gone back again. So we're not talking about, you know, opening the floodgates and a mass invasion with constantly rising population. We're talking about mainly a small number of temporary migrants who are a bit like international commuters. They're like the international bankers who crisscross the Atlantic. They work partly in New York and partly in London. The Polish builders now, who work partly at home and partly in Britain, are doing a similar thing, and they're not at all long-term settled immigrants.
How do other countries cope with this problem? I mean, which is the strictest? Probably Japan.
Yeah, I mean they have very limited immigration. But if you look at industrialised or post-industrial countries like the UK, if you look at America, Canada, France, Australia, New Zealand, they have very strict point systems. You can't get into their country unless you have a very definite skill that they want, the qualifications that they want, and very often an amount of money to add to the economy, a capital to bring in. Now, so it's very difficult to get into those countries because they have selective immigration. And of course, immigration itself is neutral. It's neither good nor bad. It depends on your need for immigration and how many people you let in and what type.
But I mean, in terms of, you're not in favour of an open door policy, are you? Or are you?
Oh, I think that borders should be as open as is politically acceptable.
So,
which I
is that yes or no?
I think yes.
Yeah. I mean, if you ask me, yes, I think borders should be, as far as I'm concerned, borders should be open. I accept that it will take time to get there, but yes, I think borders should be open.
But I don't know where this is going to go. Are we going to concrete over the Lake District, and are we going to, level the mountains in Wales and Scotland so that people can live there?
It's funny, wherever you go, people. I go around the world to talk about immigration issues, and it's funny, everywhere you go, people are absolutely convinced that everyone wants to come to their part of the world. I mean, it's true whether you go to Sweden, whether you go to Australia, even where you go to South Africa. Everyone's convinced everyone wants to come here. Now that clearly isn't true, and we have had this massive natural experiment going on in the European Union recently, where, as Gerard says, all 500 million people could move to Britain if they want to. There is nothing stopping them doing so. Now, even the highest estimates is like 1 million people have come in a few years and have then gone back again. So if we're talking about 1 out of 500 million where people can move freely, the notion that with borders more open, that everyone would come and stay, I think is a complete fallacy.
They don't have to come. They don't have to come. Just a tiny proportion of that population needs to come, and it gives you the massive problems that we've had in the economy with the lack of the public services to deal with these people, and you give yourself all these attendant problems. And I know the discussion's coming to an end, but I would have liked to have got onto the subject of the economy, because I don't believe it actually benefits the economy, especially those people at the bottom end of the economic, at the bottom of the economic ladder.
Thank you for being with us. They are called goats. When Gordon Brown became Prime Minister of the UK, he brought in some non-political experts to help run the government. It was called a government of all talents, GOATS for short. And one of the most prominent GOATs is the surgeon turned health minister. Well, he's now both, in fact. He keeps going with both. Ara Darzi. Born in Iraq and medically trained in Ireland, Ara Darzi has become one of the most prominent doctors in the UK's National Health Service. And so he's covered a field and he knows what he's talking about. Let me begin by saying, as you look around the world, is there one health service that is, one health system that is better than any other, or not?
Well, Sir David, healthcare systems across the globe are challenged in all aspects, and you could pick and choose which is the best. I obviously have the bias. I strongly believe that the NHS, which has stood the test of time, 60 years old now, is one of the best healthcare systems around the globe.
And so what about the rest of the world? Is the US a lesson to people in the world? The French system is very expensive, you said.
It is. The US healthcare system is, they certainly spend significantly more money per GDP, and the costs are escalating, and at the same time, you may be aware there are 48 million people who are uninsured, who have no access to healthcare. And there's also issues of quality and the inequalities that exist there. The French system is a good system, is much more expensive. It is a social insurance type of a system, but the French government itself at the moment is looking how to reform the French healthcare system.
Can only rich countries, or relatively rich countries, if there are any after the credit crunch, but is it only rich countries that can afford to provide a decent health system for the people? I mean, can poor countries do that? Can poor countries have a good healthcare system?
The answer is yes, and I strongly believe in that. I mean, we created the National Health Service post-war, Second World War in 1948. And you know, it's become part of our social fabric. One of the most important values and principles of the NHS is to have care available to you, irrespective of your ability to pay. And I think that ethos is becoming much more relevant 60 years later. And the Americans, policymakers are thinking in those terms, and certainly many developing countries in the Middle East and the Far East are looking at these models very carefully.
But in terms of funding, the costs are rising, obviously. That makes more of a problem if you take a country like, why name anyone, but Bangladesh, for instance. Now, how does Bangladesh afford a better health system?
Sure, the costs are rising, and I couldn't agree more with that. And the challenges ahead of us are significantly different than the challenges we've had in the past, and I will come to those. I think most healthcare systems could provide a comprehensive cover at a very cheap cost, mostly around primary and community services. And we know the evidence base is there. The biggest impact you can have on the health of the nation is in areas of public health and primary and community services. And I think countries like Bangladesh and others are looking also, you know, at developing countries, and how do we invest in the infrastructure of primary and community services.
And at the moment, if you look at the figures, life expectancy in some of the richer countries is 80 plus. Life expectancy in some of the poorer countries is under 40. Now, is that gap going to grow in the next decade?
I mean, certainly our life expectancy in the developed world is increasing by about 5 hours a day. I mean, if I could give you the example.
5 hours a day?
Yes. 1948 and 2008, 60 years later, the average person in England is living 10 years longer. And that's a great reflection of the achievements of the NHS, technology, and having a healthcare system that is universal. The answer to is the gap increasing between the developed and the developing countries. I think I don't believe that's the case, because I think if we invest in public health arenas in some of the developing countries, in looking at the water, sewage, vaccination, immunization, I think we can really reduce that inequalities, the global inequalities that exist.
That's good news. Thank you very much for being with us, Ara. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll come back for more of this
on
another occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right now, though, it's the end of the programme for this week. Many thanks to all of my guests, Ara and all of them. And we hope that you'll join us again at the same time, same spot on the dial, next week.